Black pilot denied entry to cockpit. Moments later, she grounds the airline after exposing safety violations. Avery Morrison's dream was never small. She grew up in a humble neighborhood, enchanted by the roar of planes above her grandmother's house. From the moment she saw those sleek metal birds cutting through the sky, she knew she wanted to command them. She wanted to break barriers, defy expectations, and chase the horizon without letting anyone clip her wings. Welcome, everyone, to this story of resilience, revelation, and reckoning. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this tale might just change the way you view travel and justice. Avery Morrison was born in Willow Creek, a small town overshadowed by a sprawling airport on its outskirts. Even as a child, she felt the ground vibrate whenever planes took off. She would watch them ascend from behind a chain-link fence with curious eyes. Her grandmother, a hard-working nurse who had marched in civil rights protests decades earlier, recognized Avery's fascination early on and nurtured it. Whenever Avery pressed her face to the fence, her grandmother stood beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, whispering words of encouragement about how a new generation must carry forward old dreams. Avery's father was rarely in the picture. He'd left to pursue a series of odd jobs in different states, always promising to return, but never truly staying. Her mother worked 2 jobs to keep the household afloat. For young Avery, the idea of flight became more than a childhood interest. It was symbolic of freedom, a way to rise above the challenges she saw daily. As she progressed through school, she excelled in math and science, pushing herself to meet the academic requirements for aviation scholarships, determined to break any barrier placed in her path. It wasn't an easy road. She was the only black girl in her high school's small aviation club, where her presence raised more than a few eyebrows among the parents. Some would say, "Oh, she's just going through a phase," or "she'll move on to something else soon." Their doubts were a constant background hum. Yet Avery never let that hum become a roar that would drown out her ambition. She studied fiercely, clocked hours in flight simulators, and memorized charts of planes and parts until her eyes burned late at night. When Avery graduated from high school, her sights were set on an aeronautical university that offered a specialized pilot training program. With the support of her grandmother, she secured a scholarship and ventured into a world that felt simultaneously grand and unwelcoming. Standing in the flight school's lobby with luggage in hand, she felt the weight of expectations and the press of skepticism. She was outnumbered, rarely saw anyone else who looked like her, and sometimes overheard remarks that carried a subtle or overt sting. Yet, she carried herself with pride, focused on her ultimate mission: to fly the jets that soared overhead each day. During her flight training, Avery met an instructor named Ethan Delgado, a man with a warm demeanor and genuine desire to see students excel. He didn't care about stereotypes, he cared about skill. He challenged Avery to become better than she ever imagined possible. "You have a natural feel for the yoke," he told her, after her first practice landing. "Don't let anything in your head tell you otherwise." Those words became a mantra for Avery, a reminder that she had come too far to let external doubts or internal fears ground her. Avery's mother, though supportive, worried incessantly about the dangers of aviation. She sent text messages filled with prayers and cautions about weather, mechanical failures, even terrorist threats. Avery understood her mother's fears sprang from love, but she also recognized the importance of forging a path that was her own. Her grandmother's pride, on the other hand, was boundless. The elderly woman saved every newspaper clipping mentioning the flight program and posted them on the fridge, even if Avery's name wasn't in them. "One day, they'll write about you," her grandmother would say, "and I'll have a whole wall of clippings just for you." By the time Avery finished her intensive flight training, she was already on the radar of several regional airlines. The pilot shortage in the industry had opened doors for promising newcomers, but the path still had its challenges. She interviewed with numerous companies, receiving polite rejections from a few that offered thin reasons, though Avery suspected her presence might have unsettled some who clung to archaic beliefs. Eventually, SkyNova Airlines, a growing carrier known for expanding routes in underserved areas, offered her a first officer position. It felt like a dream come true, a chance to prove her capabilities, serve diverse communities, and take one step closer to being a captain. Her first week at SkyNova was a whirlwind of paperwork, training modules, and trying to get a feel for the airline's culture. Some colleagues were welcoming, impressed by Avery's flight hours and academic accolades. Others watched her with guarded eyes, questioning her competency in hushed tones. One of them was a senior pilot named Martin Harlow, known for his gruff demeanor and old-school attitudes. Whenever Avery tried to be friendly, Harlow responded with curt nods or dismissive grunts. She could sense his discomfort but tried not to internalize it, reminding herself that she was there to do her job, not to win popularity contests. A turning point came a couple of months into her tenure. She was assigned to fly a short-haul route from Boston to Baltimore. The flight deck was a cramped, tense space when she arrived. Captain Harlow sat in the left seat, systematically running through checklists. Avery offered a polite greeting, but he barely acknowledged her. As they prepared for takeoff, she noticed small things, his clipped instructions, the way he never once made eye contact, and the tension in his jaw as if her very presence was an intrusion. Still, she maintained her professionalism, executing her duties with precision. When they landed, everything seemed routine. But after the passengers deplaned, Harlow cornered Avery in the cockpit, scowling. He said, "You stay on the lines, you do your job. Don't think you can waltz in here with a chip on your shoulder, expecting special treatment because of what you look like." The sting was immediate, as though the air had been sucked from the cabin. Avery tried to remain calm, replying that she had never expected anything except a fair assessment of her skills. Harlow scoffed, leaving without another word. She sat alone for a moment, her heart pounding. The walls of the cockpit, once a sanctuary, now felt confining. The next few flights with Harlow followed a similar pattern. He'd offer subtle jabs, question her knowledge in front of flight attendants, or pretend not to hear her suggestions during critical phases of flight. Avery endured it, but the strain began to show in her demeanor, and her close friend Bianca Moore, a flight attendant who had bonded with Avery over shared ambitions, noticed her weariness. "Is that man giving you trouble?" Bianca asked one afternoon, as they walked together through the terminal. Avery hesitated before sharing the details, worried about appearing weak. But eventually, she admitted the hostility, and Bianca's eyes blazed with protectiveness. Bianca encouraged Avery to report the harassment to Human Resources, but Avery felt conflicted. Part of her worried about jeopardizing her still-fresh career. Another part felt that complaining might confirm stereotypes, like she was too sensitive or couldn't hack it. She resolved to keep her head down and focus on becoming a top-notch pilot, hoping that excellence would overshadow prejudice. Nonetheless, a seed of resentment and disappointment had been planted. SkyNova had seemed like an inclusive place on paper. In practice, certain corners of its culture still reeked of outdated biases. Weeks turned into months, and Avery racked up flight hours with different captains. Some were professional and courteous, others more aloof, but not overtly hostile. She started to build a reputation as a dependable first officer. Yet, the tension with Harlow persisted whenever their schedules intersected, creating an undercurrent of stress. She found solace in the camaraderie of people like Bianca and her flight instructor-turned-mentor Ethan Delgado, who sometimes flew as a contract pilot with SkyNova. Ethan offered words of encouragement and practical advice, reminding her that adversity was often a stepping stone for those who refused to quit. One particular flight with Ethan at the helm proved to be a confidence boost. They navigated a challenging route through thunderstorms, requiring split-second decision-making. Avery handled the approach impeccably, earning Ethan's praise. As they waited for a gate to open after landing, he said quietly, "You've got the instincts of a seasoned pilot. Don't let the negativity weigh you down. Keep focusing on what you do best." She appreciated his faith in her, knowing that at least one colleague recognized her capability kept her spirits from sinking too low. Amid the personal battles, Avery started noticing something peculiar about Skynova's operations. Maintenance delays were becoming more frequent, and rumors circulated among staff about cost-cutting measures that might compromise safety. Overhearing technicians grumble about outdated parts and rushed inspections set off alarm bells in Avery's mind. She came from a background where rules and procedures were paramount, especially in aviation. Any lapse in maintenance or safety protocols could mean disaster. Yet, every time she tried to raise concerns casually, she was met with tight-lipped responses or shrugged shoulders. Some even told her, "Focus on your flight deck tasks. Let the maintenance folks handle their own issues." A small but significant incident occurred during an early morning flight out of Chicago. Avery noticed that a hydraulic fluid indicator reading was slightly off from the standard. She brought it up to the captain on that flight, a woman named Captain Laurel Hayes, known for her meticulous approach. Hayes took the concern seriously, ordering an additional inspection. The ground crew eventually discovered a small leak. Although it was repaired quickly, the fact that such an issue had slipped through pre-flight checks worried Avery. She started to question whether thorough inspections were sometimes skipped to keep schedules on track. Avery's curiosity and sense of responsibility drove her to look deeper. She began discreetly talking to various staff members, mechanics, flight attendants, gate agents, trying to glean insights about how the airline handled safety protocols. Some spoke openly about frustrations with the corporate push to reduce turnaround times. Others clammed up, fearful of repercussions. Avery felt torn. She had a professional duty to report any potential violations, but she also feared becoming a target. She had already experienced hostility from certain quarters because of her background. Blowing the whistle might label her a troublemaker or a problem employee. Around the same time, Bianca came to Avery with troubling stories from crew gossip. Several flight attendants had raised concerns about recurring electrical issues on older aircraft. The overhead lights flickered inconsistently, and while these incidents were minor, they signaled bigger potential problems. Bianca hinted that a union representative named Jocelyn Reed was collecting data on these safety anomalies, hoping to force the airline to address them. Avery listened with an anxious heart, her mind spinning with scenarios of how a single overlooked defect could escalate into a catastrophic event. As rumors built, so did Avery's unease. She made mental notes of every minor glitch, every overlooked mechanical detail. She asked Ethan for advice, though only in vague terms to avoid dragging him into her suspicions. He told her, doing the right thing in aviation is never optional. It's mandatory. If you see something, speak up. Lives are at stake. His words galvanized her, reaffirming that moral clarity should outweigh fear of corporate backlash. Then came a pivotal morning when Avery arrived at the airport for a flight to Denver. She approached the aircraft and found the maintenance log incomplete. The sheet indicated a resolved issue with a landing gear indicator, but there were no mechanic signatures or final clearance stamps. Concerned, she asked ground staff about it, but they seemed rushed and unresponsive. The departure time loomed, and the gate agent announced boarding. Avery, uneasy, tried to get a clear answer before stepping into the cockpit. The ground crew supervisor assured her it was a clerical oversight. But her instincts screamed otherwise. Inside the cockpit, she saw that the captain assigned to that flight was none other than Martin Harlow. Her stomach churned. Harlow was running through the pre-flight checks, ignoring Avery's presence. She took her seat, strapped in, and began her part of the checklist, noticing the same incomplete log in the binder. Summoning courage, she addressed Harlow. "Captain, the maintenance log for the landing gear issue isn't finalized. I think we should have this cleared up before takeoff." Harlow gave her a piercing look. "We're on a tight schedule," he said icily. "If it was serious, they would have grounded us. Are you questioning your superior's judgment?" Avery felt her pulse quicken. She knew pressing the point could escalate tensions, but the risk of not pressing it could be disastrous. "I'm not questioning them," she said, steadying her voice, "but as the first officer, it's my responsibility to ensure everything is properly documented. I suggest we get a sign-off from maintenance before we go." Harlow's jaw tightened. "Fine," he snapped, "but if this turns into a delay, it's on your record." He stormed off to make a phone call. 10 long minutes later, a mechanic arrived, verifying that the landing gear issue had indeed been fully fixed, but the paperwork had been neglected in the hurry to get the plane ready. The flight took off late, and Harlow's frustration was palpable the entire journey. Even though Avery had done the right thing, the aftermath left her feeling tense. Harlow's glare, the hush from the crew, and the overhead whisperings from the flight attendants all converged into a moment of emotional weight. She questioned whether the airline itself encouraged a culture where safety took a back seat to punctuality. Could she stand by and allow that? Her sense of duty warred with her desire to keep her position. She had worked so hard to earn her place in the cockpit, yet she sensed something bigger was at stake than her personal career. Upon landing in Denver, Harlow wasted no time filing a complaint against Avery, accusing her of insubordination and causing an unnecessary delay. The flight operations manager at the Denver hub, a woman named Sharon Perry, pulled Avery aside in a drab office lined with flight manuals. "I need to understand your version of events," Perry said, her tone neutral. Avery explained every detail, providing the incomplete log as evidence. Perry exhaled, rubbing her temples. "All right, thank you for being thorough," she said. "I'll look into this, but keep in mind, Captain Harlow is well regarded by certain higher-ups. This could become complicated." Feeling the weight of potential fallout, Avery left the office. She tried to remain calm, reminding herself that she had simply followed proper procedure. Over the next few days, the complaint lingered, with no immediate resolution. Avery continued her flight assignments, each day feeling a heavier sense of unease. She noticed more and more minor discrepancies, unusual engine sounds, pressurization quirks, flickering cabin lights that rarely received the scrutiny they deserved. Crew members were edgy, often attributing it to corporate edicts about staying on schedule. Tensions reached a boiling point when Avery discovered a leaked memo circulating among staff. The memo, allegedly from corporate executives, instructed ground crews to minimize downtime at all costs and limit extraneous checks that could cause delays. It didn't explicitly advocate skipping important procedures, but the language strongly implied that time was paramount, overshadowing caution. Morale at Sky Nova sank as rumors spread of cost-cutting that endangered the reliability of the fleet. That same week, Bianca confided in Avery that 2 of her fellow flight attendants had been disciplined for reporting a suspicious fuel odor mid-flight. They'd insisted the pilot divert to the nearest airport, incurring extra costs. Instead of praise for diligence, they received official reprimands for causing an operational hiccup. Hearing this, Avery felt an icy dread. It confirmed her growing suspicion that the airline prioritized profit over prudence. Every fiber of her being told her this was wrong, that it wouldn't be long before a more serious incident occurred if the culture didn't change. Unsure where else to turn, Avery reached out to Union Representative Jocelyn Reed, whom she'd heard was compiling data on safety lapses. They met quietly at a coffee shop near the airport. Reed was a middle-aged woman with a calm yet commanding presence. She listened intently as Avery recounted everything: incomplete logs, mechanical oversights, discouraged reporting of concerns. Reed's expression remained stoic, but her eyes flickered with alarm. "We've been gathering evidence for months," Reed said, stirring her cup of tea. "We just needed someone inside the cockpit to confirm these patterns. Thank you for stepping forward, but be cautious. The company might not take kindly to whistleblowers." Avery felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Finally, she wasn't alone in her suspicions, but she also recognized the peril of openly challenging the airline's practices. Reed explained that the union planned to escalate these concerns to regulatory authorities if they could compile irrefutable evidence. "We need logs, recorded conversations, anything that shows a deliberate neglect of safety," she said. Avery nodded, uncertain but resolute. She couldn't turn away from what she knew, even if it risked her job. In the days that followed, Avery found herself tiptoeing around the subject, collecting and organizing data. She saved copies of flight logs with discrepancies, took notes of any remarks from maintenance crews, and quietly encouraged other pilots to report anomalies. Her living room at home transformed into a covert documentation center, files stacked high on the coffee table. Her grandmother noticed her stress levels skyrocketing, but didn't pry too deeply, trusting Avery's judgment. Occasionally, her grandmother would bring hot cocoa, place it beside her, and whisper, "Standing up for what's right takes courage. Don't give up." During that tumultuous period, Avery frequently flew with a range of captains. Some grew suspicious of her meticulous approach to logs and minor issues. She found subtle hostility from certain captains who favored quick turnarounds. Others quietly admired her thoroughness, though they feared taking similar stands because they had families to support and were wary of retaliation. All the while, the tension with Captain Harlow simmered in the background. His complaint against her had been tabled pending further review, but he glared at her whenever they crossed paths in the pilot lounge. Everything came to a head on a fateful day when Avery was slated for a transcontinental flight from New York to Los Angeles. The route was crucial for Skynova, a prestige run that symbolized the airline's expanding ambitions. Avery arrived at the airport early, double-checking the flight plan and weather conditions. She was determined to ensure every aspect of the aircraft was in order, given the length of the flight. As she approached the plane, she spotted a hurried maintenance team exiting with scowls on their faces. One mechanic paused long enough to mutter, "They're forcing us to sign off on something we didn't fully fix," before another hushed him, and they both disappeared. Her stomach clenched. She boarded the plane, stepping into the cockpit with heightened alertness. This time, her captain was a man named Russell Kane, known for his jovial demeanor and easygoing approach. Avery didn't know him well, but he seemed professional enough. They exchanged greetings, and she carefully checked the logbook. A note about the Auxiliary Power Unit, APU, flickered at her. It mentioned an intermittent malfunction, supposedly repaired. Avery asked Captain Kane if he was aware of any issues. He shrugged. "Maintenance says it's fine now. Let's trust them. We're already behind schedule." As passengers boarded, Avery's anxiety grew. She tried to contact ground crew to verify the APU fix, but she got brushed off with, "It's cleared, no more questions." Torn between her duty and the pressure to depart on time, she finished her pre-flight checks meticulously, noticing the engine readings were slightly off normal ranges. She mentioned it to Captain Kane, who insisted everything was within acceptable limits. Her instincts buzzed with warnings, but she felt cornered by the protocols. The final boarding call went out, and they sealed the aircraft doors, pushing back from the gate. The taxi and takeoff appeared normal, but once in the air, an unusual rumble resonated from the rear of the plane. The flight attendants reported flickering cabin lights again, and a passenger seated near the back described a strange burning smell. Avery alerted Captain Kane, who acknowledged the reports but was reluctant to take immediate action. "Let's monitor," he said, sounding more uncertain now. A short while later, an alarm flashed on the instrument panel, indicative of an electrical malfunction, possibly tied to the APU or a related system. Sweat beaded on Avery's forehead. She urged the captain to consider an emergency landing. Kane hesitated, concerned about the operational costs and potential blowback from management. He tried troubleshooting steps, resetting systems, but the alarm persisted. Avery felt a rush of anger. This indecision was precisely what she feared. A culture that delayed critical decisions. She asserted herself firmly. "Captain, we have an active alarm. We have multiple reports from the cabin. We need to divert. We can't compromise on safety." After a tense moment, Kane agreed, directing them to the nearest major airport. The landing was tense, but ultimately safe. Emergency services waited on the runway, and passengers were evacuated without further incident. However, the fiasco unleashed a wave of inquiries. The media got wind of the unscheduled landing, and the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, launched an investigation. That same evening, as Avery sat in a debriefing room, the exhaustion and relief mingled in her mind. She recalled the mechanic's whispered words about being forced to sign off on a partial fix. Her convictions hardened. The airline was playing a dangerous game, and she could no longer stand by silently. In the aftermath, Captain Kane tried to pin blame on the maintenance department, while the maintenance supervisor insisted the flight crew should have conducted additional checks. Tensions flared, each department pointing fingers. Avery watched from the sidelines, feeling as though she was observing a tragic play where no one wanted to admit wrongdoing. Meanwhile, the FAA investigators requested documentation from the flight crew, logs, and any relevant communications. Avery found herself in a moral quandary. Should she hand over the data she'd been collecting to the investigators, or work through the union as originally planned? Reed, the union rep, called Avery into her office, which was actually a small rented space in a rundown building near the airport. An air of urgency filled the room. Reed explained that a class action lawsuit, or at least a collective complaint, might be the best approach. "We have enough to show a pattern of neglect," Reed said. "But we need a pilot willing to stand as a key witness, someone who has first-hand knowledge of these issues." Avery's chest tightened. She could sense the gravity of this request. Standing publicly against Skynova could mean the end of her career there, and possibly in aviation as a whole. Still, she remembered the fear on passengers' faces and the quiet warnings from mechanics. She thought about Bianca and other flight attendants who were disciplined for reporting problems. She recalled Harlow's intimidation and the cost of silence. The realization that inaction could lead to a worse catastrophe emboldened her. So, she told Reed, "I'll do it. I'm willing to speak up no matter the fallout." Reed's relief was palpable. They planned a strategy: gather all the evidence, partner with a legal team that specialized in aviation whistleblower cases, and approach the FAA simultaneously. Reed cautioned that Skynova would likely retaliate. Avery understood the risks, but her determination overshadowed her fear. She was done tiptoeing around a system that jeopardized lives for efficiency statistics. Word spread quickly within certain circles that Avery was cooperating with the investigation. She noticed strange glances from some pilots, overheard hushed tones referencing her. Captain Harlow's disdain became more blatant. In the break room, he openly accused her of sabotaging the company. "You think you're some hero?" he sneered. "All you're doing is dragging us down. Do you want to see hundreds of jobs lost if the airline goes under?" Avery refused to engage in a shouting match. She quietly replied, "I'd rather see a company that values safety over profit margins. If jobs are lost, that's on the executives who ignored these problems, not on me for exposing them." Feeling isolated, Avery leaned on Bianca and Ethan for emotional support. Ethan reminded her courage has a price, but integrity is priceless. Bianca, on her part, offered comforting words and updates on how many flight attendants were rallying behind Avery's cause. Late one evening, Avery's phone rang with an unknown number. It turned out to be a mechanic who'd also decided to come forward with a statement. "I've seen them skip entire steps in inspections," he confessed anxiously. "They keep telling us to wrap things up fast. I'm tired of living with this guilt." Bolstered by these allies, Avery worked with Reed to compile an airtight dossier. They had copies of logs showing incomplete or rushed maintenance sign-offs, testimonials from multiple employees, and emails from mid-level managers pushing for less downtime. The final piece was a revealing communication chain that linked a high-ranking executive to directives mandating cost-saving measures over standard protocol. Avery felt like each new piece of evidence was a stone in a growing wall of accountability. The day she handed over the dossier to the FAA officials was surreal. Standing in the agency's austere office, she felt her heart pound, but a calm sense of purpose filled her. The lead investigator, a stern-faced man, sifted through the papers, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Though he kept his professional composure, Avery detected a glimmer of concern in his eyes, as if he realized the scope of the issue might be larger than initially suspected. When she left, the weight on her shoulders lifted marginally, replaced by cautious hope. She had done what she felt was right. Almost immediately, Skynova's legal department tried to discredit her. They floated rumors that she was incompetent, referencing Captain Harlow's complaint about insubordination. They insinuated that her actions were motivated by a personal vendetta. Some staff, desperate to protect their positions, sided with management, claiming they had no knowledge of any safety problems, but those illusions were shattered when more employees stepped forward, sharing their own experiences. Soon, the narrative of a lone disgruntled employee fell apart under the weight of multiple testimonies. Even in the face of mounting evidence, the airline's upper echelons refused to admit wrongdoing. They issued statements of corporate denial, praising their safety record and attributing any mechanical issues to standard industry challenges. The tension grew as the investigation deepened, drawing media attention. Journalists dug into Skynova's past, uncovering a pattern of quiet settlements with employees who had raised concerns in the past. The story became a national talking point, sparking debates about corporate responsibility and racial bias in the aviation industry. Amid this chaos, Avery continued to fulfill her scheduled flights, but the airline soon found ways to sideline her. They reduced her roster, gave her less desirable routes, and engaged in subtle retaliations. She sometimes arrived at the crew lounge to find her locker vandalized with hateful remarks referencing both her whistleblowing and her race. The heartbreak was profound, but she channeled her pain into resolve, refusing to let bigotry and intimidation deter her from the truth. Simultaneously, the FAA ramped up inspections. They conducted surprise audits on several Skynova aircraft, uncovering faulty wiring, overdue part replacements, and discrepancies in maintenance logs. Public outcry intensified. Passengers demanded explanations, especially those who had flown recently. The pressure on Skynova became immense, and the airline's stock value plummeted. Executives scrambled to put out fires with public relations statements, but faith in the carrier was rapidly eroding. All the while, Avery braced for the next storm, the possibility that Skynova would find a way to terminate her. She consulted with Reed and legal counsel, documenting every instance of harassment or retaliation. The tension built like a gathering tempest, everyone wondering who would blink first. Then the inevitable happened. Avery received a notice from the airline's management, summoning her to a disciplinary hearing. The letter stated that her actions had undermined the company's integrity and risked reputational harm. The irony was not lost on her that she was being charged with risking the airline's reputation when it was the airline's neglect of safety that truly threatened its future. She attended the hearing with Reed by her side. It took place in a bland conference room near the corporate headquarters, where a panel of stern-faced executives sat in judgment. They launched into their accusations: unauthorized access to confidential logs, defamation of company procedures, insubordination. Avery countered with the facts. She produced documented proof that the logs were part of standard operations, not confidential. She showcased how her concerns were valid and how multiple employees had witnessed similar issues. Reed interjected with union rights, pointing out that whistleblower protections shielded Avery's actions. The hearing dragged on for hours, culminating in an official statement that the airline would need time to deliberate. Days later, Avery received her punishment: indefinite suspension without pay, pending further investigation. It was a blow, but Avery realized it might actually work to her advantage by illustrating clear retaliation. Instead of feeling defeated, she steeled herself. If Skynova thought suspension would silence her, they were mistaken. By now, the FAA investigation had progressed significantly. Investigators unearthed widespread falsification of maintenance records and uncovered directives from high-level management, encouraging staff to sidestep thorough checks for the sake of punctuality. Several flights that had minor incidents in the past year suddenly looked like close calls due to poor oversight. Whispers began that the FAA might ground Skynova's fleet entirely if safety could not be guaranteed. In parallel, the public relations nightmare worsened. Stories emerged of near accidents that were covered up, and families of passengers who had experienced frightening turbulence or emergency landings started demanding answers. News outlets interviewed Avery and other whistleblowers, bringing their first-hand accounts to the national stage. Avery was initially hesitant, but realized that going public might be the most impactful step. She spoke earnestly about her love for aviation and her heartbreak over the airline's practices. She also referenced the racial bias she faced, tying it into a broader narrative of systemic issues within the corporate structure. The interview with a major national network aired during prime time, featuring Avery in a calm, poised manner, explaining how she'd been denied basic respect and even entry to certain discussions because of her race and because of her insistence on following protocol. She recounted the day Captain Harlow refused her entry to the cockpit when she arrived before a flight, telling her, "You don't belong here," while blocking the doorway, insinuating she was overstepping boundaries. The footage triggered a public outcry, with viewers expressing shock and dismay. Skynova scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing statements claiming they had zero tolerance for discrimination and were conducting an internal review, but the tide had turned. Federal pressure, public outrage, and employee testimonies all converged in a perfect storm. Shortly thereafter, the FAA, in coordination with the Department of Transportation, announced mandatory groundings of Skynova's aircraft until a full safety audit could be completed. Overnight, the airline's operations ground to a halt, stranding passengers and costing the company millions in losses. The day the grounding was announced was surreal for Avery. She had been at home, scanning news updates on her phone, when an alert flashed. FAA grounds Skynova Airlines over safety concerns. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt a mix of vindication and sorrow. Despite her battles, she never wanted to see so many employees suffer. She knew thousands of jobs were in limbo, including friends like Bianca who depended on paychecks for survival. Yet she also recognized that this was the necessary consequence of negligence at the highest levels. Safety could never be optional. Public sentiment toward Avery became largely positive, with many lauding her courage. She received messages of support from across the country, even from aspiring pilots who saw her as a trailblazer. Social media buzzed with hashtags praising her for speaking truth to power. She also faced backlash from those who felt she should have handled things internally, or who believed she was overplaying the race card. Yet the overwhelming wave of support buoyed her spirits. The union set up a legal defense fund and began negotiating with the airline for her reinstatement, while also pushing for more robust safety protocols going forward. Meanwhile, Captain Harlow vanished from the scene, reportedly taking an early retirement rather than face scrutiny for his actions. Word circulated that he'd been a key enabler of management's hush-hush approach, often pressuring younger pilots to ignore minor defects to keep flights on schedule. Hearing that he was gone felt like a symbolic victory for Avery, a sign that the old guard was finally toppling. In the weeks that followed, the airline underwent a massive audit. Skynova's board fired several top executives, trying to appease regulators and salvage what remained of the company's reputation. New leadership took over, pledging transparency and a complete overhaul of safety procedures. They reached out to Avery through intermediaries, indicating they might want to settle any disputes and possibly reinstate her with a clean slate. Her legal team advised her to consider a settlement carefully, ensuring it included policy changes that would prevent future cover-ups and discrimination. While negotiations loomed, Avery received invitations to speak at industry conferences, universities, and advocacy groups. She realized her experience was bigger than just her personal journey. It was a clarion call for the aviation industry as a whole. She spoke about the necessity of upholding rigorous safety standards, the perils of corporate greed, and the need for diversity and inclusion. At one event, she shared how a simple act, being denied entry to the cockpit because of someone's biased beliefs, had snowballed into an airline-wide scandal, ultimately exposing deep-rooted problems. Soon after, the FAA concluded its audit. They laid out a stringent set of requirements Skynova had to meet before it could fly again. The airline had to replace faulty parts, implement a reliable oversight system, and retrain staff on safety protocols. Additionally, the company had to undergo mandatory sensitivity training regarding racial bias and workplace harassment. Bianca kept Avery updated on the ongoing cultural shift within the airline, describing the flurry of training sessions and the cautious hope spreading among employees. Everyone was on edge, uncertain whether the airline could survive such a drastic overhaul. Eventually, an agreement was hammered out between Avery's legal team and Skynova. It included a financial settlement for lost wages and emotional distress, but more importantly, it mandated corporate reforms. Avery chose to return to her position as a pilot under the condition that the airline stick to its promises. When she walked back into the pilot lounge for the first time post-suspension, a mix of applause and respectful nods greeted her. Some employees, once doubtful, now recognized the necessity of her actions. Though the airline had not fully recovered, the grounding was lifted in increments as the FAA cleared portions of Skynova's fleet. Avery found herself assigned to newly inspected aircraft, flying under revised protocols. The first time she took off after months of turmoil felt like a rebirth. She listened to the engines roar, felt the plane ascend, and realized she was part of something bigger, a push toward accountability and transformation. The memory of that moment, when she had been denied entry to the cockpit, still stung, but it no longer defined her. She was forging a new identity, not just as a capable pilot, but as a catalyst for change in an industry that desperately needed it. In the following months, the airline's new CEO reached out to Avery directly, asking for her input on how to reshape their safety culture. It was an olive branch that Avery cautiously accepted, seeing a genuine willingness to evolve. Meetings followed where Avery and other whistleblowers shared their insights, guiding policy updates and initiatives aimed at fostering open communication among staff, encouraging the immediate reporting of safety concerns, and ensuring disciplinary measures for anyone engaging in harassment or discrimination. Meanwhile, Avery's personal life began to stabilize. She reconnected with old friends and family, who had all been worried about the stress she'd endured. Her grandmother, in declining health, beamed with pride every time Avery walked through the door. They shared quiet afternoons reminiscing about how young Avery used to stare at planes, dreaming of the skies. "You're doing it," her grandmother would say, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're showing everyone it can be done." Ethan Delgado, her former instructor, occasionally flew with her now that he was officially on the airline's roster, making for a comfortable cockpit dynamic. Bianca continued to share updates on how flight attendants felt safer speaking up about even minor irregularities. Jocelyn Reed pushed for stronger union protections, citing Avery's ordeal as proof that employees needed robust safeguards against corporate retaliation. The airline's transformation, though not instantaneous, was undeniably in motion. One day, Avery received an invitation to speak at a town hall organized by local aviation schools aiming to encourage underrepresented youth to consider careers in aviation. She initially hesitated, feeling her schedule was already packed. But she accepted, remembering her own childhood dreams and the subtle and overt obstacles she had faced. Standing before a crowd of students, she recounted her journey, how she fell in love with flying, encountered discrimination, blew the whistle on safety violations, and ultimately sparked a significant industry-wide conversation. She ended by challenging them to never let fear or bias stop them from reaching for the skies, echoing the words of her grandmother about carrying forward old dreams into new generations. As time went on, the direct aftermath of the investigation settled, but the airline faced a steep climb to rebuild its image. Some employees, bitter about the disruption, still harbored resentment, blaming Avery for their shaky job security. Others saw her as a symbol of integrity. She learned to navigate these varied reactions with grace, focusing on performing her duties impeccably and advocating for continued reforms. The settlement terms required periodic reviews of the airline's compliance with safety standards, so Avery and the union stayed vigilant, ensuring no backsliding occurred. Eventually, management decided to highlight Avery's role in the airline's transformation in a new marketing campaign, aiming to showcase Skynova's commitment to improvement and diversity. While initially wary of being used for public relations spin, Avery leveraged the opportunity to emphasize that genuine change was non-negotiable. Interviews, social media posts, and internal newsletters featured her quotes about the importance of accountability. She insisted that any portrayal of her story reflect the reality, that she was forced to act because corners were being cut, and that racism played a significant part in fueling her isolation. In response, some external critics accused her of capitalizing on adversity. A few industry pundits dismissed her stance, accusing her of dramatizing the airline's flaws. She tried not to be disheartened. She had learned that you couldn't control every narrative. What mattered was the tangible impact: safer planes, a more transparent corporate culture, and a chance for the next generation of pilots to step into cockpits free from prejudice. Meanwhile, the FAA's final report on Sky Nova's past violations became public record. It confirmed everything Avery and her colleagues had alleged: incomplete maintenance sign-offs, a culture of pressuring crews to overlook minor issues, insufficient training for aging aircraft, and a dismissive attitude toward employee complaints. The report also noted that the airline had made significant strides in rectifying these problems, largely prompted by whistleblower actions. The public, informed by the media coverage, recognized Avery as the catalyst for that change. Despite the progress, Avery remained cautious. She knew corporate cultures could revert to old habits under financial strain. She continued to speak up whenever she noticed potential lapses, but she also saw real improvements. Mechanics seemed more at ease reporting issues. Flights regularly underwent rigorous checks, and captains were reminded to adhere strictly to standard operating procedures. On a personal level, Avery's self-confidence soared. She no longer walked on eggshells, fearing retribution or second-guessing her every move. She had stood for something she believed in, faced adversity, and emerged stronger. Through it all, her identity as a black pilot had been front and center, illuminating how racial bias added layers of difficulty to an already demanding profession. But now she carried that identity with renewed pride, aware that it set an example for others who needed reassurance that they belonged in those once exclusive spaces. Her emotional bond with flying remained intact. Every takeoff was a moment of joy, the runway dropping away beneath her, the horizon unfolding in front of her. She'd glance at the co-pilot's seat, sometimes a fresh-faced first officer looking at her with awe, sometimes an experienced aviator who treated her as an equal, and remember what it took to reach that point. The adrenaline of flight, the rush of the engines, the slight tremor in her hands as she guided the aircraft, all reaffirmed she was where she was meant to be. Behind the scenes, she and Bianca brainstormed ideas to form a support network for minority employees in aviation, so no one would feel as isolated as she had in the early days. They approached HR and the union, proposing mentorship programs and open forums. To their surprise, the new leadership endorsed the initiative, providing resources and visibility. Over time, more employees felt comfortable stepping forward with personal stories of discrimination or harassment, trusting that the company was finally serious about addressing these issues. The transformation spread outward, beyond just Sky Nova. Other airlines watched the public spectacle and adjusted their policies, not wanting to risk a similar scandal. The FAA strengthened its guidelines on reporting and whistleblower protections, citing Avery's case as evidence of the need for more robust regulations. Media outlets occasionally revisited Avery's journey in follow-up articles, noting improvements in the industry as a whole. Yet, Avery never forgot the price. She reflected on the sleepless nights, the doubt, the racial slurs, the threat of losing everything she'd worked for. She remembered her grandmother's words about how each new generation must push boundaries further than the last. Her grandmother's health had declined steadily, but Avery found solace in sitting at her bedside, recounting how far the airline had come. On one such evening, her grandmother mustered a frail smile. "You carried the dream," she whispered, "and you made it real." When her grandmother passed, Avery honored her by wearing a small pin shaped like a bird wing, an heirloom her grandmother had given her as a child. She wore it on her uniform lapel, close to her heart, a permanent reminder of her roots, her struggles, and her duty to keep flying higher. Colleagues, once indifferent or hostile, now paid quiet respects, acknowledging the personal loss of a woman who had been the silent backbone of Avery's courage. Even though Sky Nova was allowed back in the air and flights resumed, The scars remained as lessons. Every pre-flight check, every safety briefing, every conversation in the pilot lounge carried more weight. People understood that ignoring problems was no longer an option, not when the stakes were so high. The airline's leadership recognized the transformation as part of its new identity, branding itself as a cautionary tale that emerged stronger from adversity. In a final flourish of fate, Avery was promoted to captain after completing the required flight hours and evaluations. The promotion ceremony was low-key, just a few colleagues in a small break room, but as she slipped on her new captain's stripes, she felt an indescribable sense of achievement. She thought back to that young girl pressing her face against the chain-link fence, dreaming of touching the clouds. She whispered a silent prayer of thanks. Then she looked forward, determined that in her cockpit, no one would ever be denied the respect they deserved. Her first flight as captain was a short jaunt to a regional airport, but it felt monumental. Seated in the left seat, she performed the captain's checklist with steady hands, while a younger first officer looked on with admiration. As the engines roared, Avery guided the plane down the runway and lifted off. She soared into the sky with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying with her the memories of struggle, the affirmations of justice, and the promise that no one would be silenced again. The airline's schedule stabilized, and passengers gradually regained trust. News outlets covered the airline's rebirth, featuring interviews with both leadership and employees who had witnessed the turnaround. Avery's name popped up frequently, often accompanied by phrases like courageous pilot or whistleblower hero. She accepted the accolades humbly, always emphasizing that it was a collective effort. It took many voices, many sacrifices, and many hearts to reshape something as complex as an airline's culture. In the months and years that followed, Avery inspired others to remain vigilant. She networked with pilots from different carriers, sharing best practices for reporting concerns. She participated in diversity panels, highlighting how unconscious bias could jeopardize communication in high-stakes environments like aviation. Her presence became a strong counter-narrative to the notion that the cockpit was reserved for a certain race, gender, or background. She wanted the next generation to see her and think, that could be me. And so it was that Avery's story turned from one of exclusion and danger into one of redemption and renewal. She had been denied the cockpit, but through her insistence on integrity and her willingness to expose wrongdoing, she ended up reshaping an airline from the inside out. In doing so, she fulfilled not only her own childhood dream of flight, but also ignited the dreams of countless others who saw in her a reflection of their own aspirations. Time never fully erased the bitter memory of confrontation with figures like Harlow, or the haunting awareness that negligence had lurked behind the polished facade of safety. But each time she guided a plane through turbulent skies to a smooth landing, she reaffirmed her oath to protect every soul on board, to champion transparency, and to never let prejudice ground the brightest of wings. Her journey proved that even in the most rigid of spaces, one determined individual could force open the doors, ensuring that the freedom of the skies belonged to everyone.